In one of Charles Dickens' earliest novels, he tells the story of a little orphan boy named Oliver who was born into a life of poverty in London in the mid-19th century. His mother died during childbirth. His father, for some reason, went AWOL. And for 9 years, he's raised in a boys' home where basically his needs are provided for, but not much else. Not any extra food, not any extra care, and certainly not any extra love, all of which every person in this world needs. At 9 years of age, he then is sentenced to a work farm where other orphan boys go and are exploited at best. And in one of the classic scenes, which is this one right here, the boys are sitting at the table, they've gotten their bowl, and it's not enough. And so they decide to draw straws to determine who will go and ask the taskmaster for more. The short end of the stick falls to Oliver. And so in that classic scene, he gets up from the table with his bowl in his hands, and trembling, he walks up to the taskmaster. And if you remember your English literature, you'll remember his classic line. And if you don't and you can read, it's on the screen. Please, sir, I want some more. Since we live in the desert of sorrow and sin, I want to ask you, is that how you feel every day about your need for God? Please, Father, I need you more than yesterday. I need you, Lord, more than words can say. I need you more than ever before. I need you, Lord. I need you more than the air I breathe, more than the song I sing, more than the next heartbeat, more than anything. And Lord, as time goes by, I'll be on your side because I never want to go back to my old life. And that's what we're going to see today in a very familiar story. So if you brought your Bibles, let me ask you to open them with me to John chapter 4. But before we study this very familiar story, I want to ask you, is that really our mindset, or are they just nice words to a modern hymn? Is our mindset really like Oliver, that I want more, or is it closer to what Wilbur Reese wrote, I'd like to buy $3 worth of God? Please, not enough to explode my soul or disturb my spirit, just enough to maybe snooze in the sunshine and experience some form of happiness, but not transformation. I'd just like to buy $3 worth of God, please. Which is it? Which is it? I believe I know which one best describes the group that just got back in last night from a week in the blazing sun and more children than you can count in Antigua. I believe I know which ones would best describe the sons of Korah in Psalms 42 at a time when, for some unknown reason, they were prevented from going to an assembly like this at the house of God. So they compared themselves to a deer who's on the run in a drought. I picture his tongue hanging out, and what does he want? In the words of an old balladeer, Marty Robbins, he just wants water, cool, clear water. It's what he wants. And so they said, as the deer pants, that word pants is an intense longing. That word pant there is a heaving. Because as Amos said, there's a famine in the land. Not of bread or water, but for hearing the word of God. As the deer pants for the water, so my soul longs after you. You alone, they sang, are my heart's desire. Where can I go and meet with my God? They weren't able to, they longed to. That's, again, the question. Is that our mindset? As I was fine-tuning this lesson on Thursday, the chimes of our doorbell in the office rang. It was a lady whose car had broken down here on Cox Creek, and she had walked across our front lot and come to the door. She was wringing wet with sweat. She wanted to use the phone. And after Sarah gave her access to a phone, then Sarah asked, would you like some water? Now, I'm just going to ask this question. How many of you think she had to contemplate it? How many of you think she was polite and said, well, no, thank you? And how many think that she took it just like that? It wasn't long afterwards until the chimes rang again. This time as a man soaking wet, looking for help. And after we helped him, then guess what she offered him? Water. And how many think he had to contemplate whether he wanted it or not? You get it. You see, with all of the senseless violence and shootings and everything else going on in our country and the world today, there's absolutely zero doubt in my mind that we need more God. And we need more Christians who are going to live out their faith in the Prince of Peace, the great reconciler of our souls. We need more people to be like Jesus in this story. Now, I realize that many of you have heard this story preached hundreds of times. Every preacher in here has preached it at many different times at some point in their preaching ministry. Our Brotherhood's most well-known author featured it in his fabulous book, Cast of Characters. But please do not let the familiarity of the story lessen the impact of the point that we're trying to bring home this morning. And the point is in the words of one of my preaching friends. He said, and I quote, "The paradox of our time is that we spend more but have less. We buy more but seem to enjoy it less. We have bigger houses and smaller families, more conveniences but seemingly less time. We have more medicines but less wellness. Many of us read too little and watch TV too much, and we pray too seldom, and it's often too shallow. We have multiplied our possessions but reduced our values. These are the days of tall men but maybe short on character, and certainly the days of shallow relationships. These are the days of two incomes but more divorce, of fancier houses but broken homes. We've learned how to make a living but not a life. We've added years to life but not life to years. We've tried to clean up the air but often polluted the soul. While we may have learned a lot through digital information, have we improved our ability to love, forgive, and nurture? That's a great question, isn't it? Here's another one. While we're gaining understanding about the world, have we grown in our knowledge of the Creator of the world? Despite all the junk food that's available to fill our hunger, it's obvious that something's still missing. And evidences of that are seen everywhere in all the loneliness, emptiness, shattered dreams, broken relationships, substance abuse, acts of violence that surround us. These, however, listen to this insightful line, aren't the real problem. Rather, they're symptoms of a much larger problem. Maggie Ross has pinpointed the deeper issue. Would you listen closely to what she said? We try to fill up that ghastly hole in the pit of our stomachs, but it's a hole that's really in our souls. We try to fill it, and she names a number of things: greener grass, newer things, more money, on and on she goes. But then she says, someday, hopefully, someone will finally come to the realization that our real thirst is for God. And then my preacher friend finishes by saying this: here's the truth. Only God can quench our deepest thirst. Getting married can't. Finding a new friend won't do it. Unraveling your past with a therapist can help, but it won't do it. Adding 20% to your income won't do it. Winning the lottery won't do it. But thirsting for God and His will and His Word will. I believe there's truth to that. When we really want God more than we want what we currently have, that's when our lives will really begin to change. That's when churches will really begin to change. It's when our country will really begin to change. And it's when countries like Antigua and the United States and other places represented up here by these flags will be changed, one person, one community, one neighborhood, one nation at a time. With that said, let's read a few verses here of this very familiar story. Now Jesus learned that the Pharisees had heard that he was gaining and baptizing more disciples than John, although in fact it was not Jesus who baptized, but his disciples. There's a level of competition going on here, sadly, but it's true. So he left Judea and went back once more to Galilee. Now he had to go through Samaria. In every lesson that you've heard preached and taught about Jesus and this thirsty woman, every teacher and preacher worth his weight has stressed that Jesus had to go through Samaria. Most of God's people hated the Samaritans, whom they considered to be impure and unclean, as Brother Caperton alluded to. And the feeling was mutual. The hatred that some of Jesus' disciples had for the Samaritans raised and reared its ugly head in Luke chapter 9. When they looked at Jesus in this part of the world as they were walking through Samaria and said, will you grant us permission to just call down fire from heaven and wipe them all out? You may remember the story. It's well known in Luke 10. A story that we call the Good Samaritan, but in that day there was no such thing. At least in the eyes of God's people, there weren't. A local preacher preached that story to his congregation a few miles from this building right now. And in his sermon, he said, there's a beaten and bruised man on the side of Cox Creek Parkway. And he said, let's say two preachers walk by. Let's say they preach for the churches of Christ. And they see that man beaten and bruised and left half dead. And they choose to go on to their responsibilities that morning, excited about assembling with their brethren. But another man walks down this road. He's a member of the ISIS regime overseas. He sees him. He stops. He stops the bleeding, takes him to ECM, pays the bill, gives him contact information, and tells them if it takes more in terms of expense to bring him back to health, send me the bill. That's how God's people in the first century would have heard that story. And let me ask you, does it shed a little different light on it when you hear it that way? You see, don't lose the fact that Jesus had to go through Samaria, because most of God's people didn't have to go that way. Oh, it's the shortest distance between 2 points. But most of them would rather go over to the Jordan River and cross it and go either up the eastern side or western, depending on whether you're going north or south, and come in up above and just avoid them altogether. And the Samaritans were certainly okay with that because they didn't like to associate with those people who didn't like them anyway. And so what did they do? They built them a house of worship on Mount Gerizim. And they could avoid God's people entirely. You see, I don't know if you've ever been in those shoes or not, but I dare say that most of us have. Have you ever seen somebody and when you saw them, you made a quick duck of the head and decided to go a different route so that maybe you didn't have to engage them? Or I wonder if maybe many churches are like the Samaritans in that they would much rather stay in their own little cocoon than have to get out of their comfort zone and go down to Jerusalem and deal with the tension and the stress of worshiping with people whom we don't see eye to eye with. Or flip it to God's people. I wonder if we felt the same. You see, Jesus had to go through Samaria. And he wasn't going to let his culture nor his brethren dictate his behavior. Nothing or no one was going to keep him from carrying on with his mission. And please don't lose sight of the fact of what Jesus sees that they don't see, which is recorded down in verse 34. Jesus knows that the fields around him here are white and ready and ripe for a spiritual harvest. His disciples can't see it, but he believes there are people around him who are thirsty. And so Jesus has to go through Samaria. Now make sure you understand this. In the fallen world we live in, there is always a spiritual war that's going on. Some people just are aware of it, some people are not. But whether you're aware of it or not doesn't change the fact it's going on. And we can deny it's going on all we want to. But the reality is that the enemy of our soul loves for people who were created in the image of God to isolate themselves from other people, particularly those that are different. And the enemy of our souls would love for God's children to let their differences divide them and isolate them, rather than to be reconciled and work toward reconciliation and peace. But Jesus gives us an entirely different path to follow. He had to go through Samaria. Why? Because thirsty souls were more important to him than maintaining the status quo. Verses 5 and 6. So he came to a town in Samaria called Sychar, near the plot of ground Jacob had given to his son Joseph. Jacob's well was there, and Jesus, tired as he was from the journey, sat down by the well. It was about noon. I believe the disciples were fairly anxious as they walked through Samaria. Much would rather have avoided it, but Jesus had to go there. They're about half a mile from the center of town when they came to Jacob's well. Let me show you a picture of it here. When you tour the Holy Lands, as I've been blessed to do, and some here have as well, most tour guides will take you to these stories that are recorded in the Bible, and they'll tell you that you're in close proximity to the area where it actually happened. It's actually spine-tingling to know that you're close, and then they'll tell you the story. But most of the tour guides today, most of the Jewish people today, and most all of the archaeologists today who are very familiar with that part of the world will take you, when you go to this area, they'll take you here and they will not speculate on whether this was the well or not. They'll tell you with 100% certainty, this was it. This is Jacob's well. This is the well, the parcel of land that he purchased after his reconciliation with his brother Esau in Genesis 33. Do you remember that story? They wasted a lot of years of life because they couldn't reconcile with one another. But they finally reconcile, and when they do, Jacob buys this parcel of land, and he digs this well. William Barclay said it was 100 feet deep. He digs this well, and it's part of their spiritual heritage. Just like the wells that are being dug today by the generosity of many people here. They're special to people in this church, and they're providing water for either church, for people in villages near churches of Christ in Zimbabwe, or churches of Christ that are going to spring up from there. And you can go and you can ask the Willinghams if John's well is special to them. Denise has drank from that water. You ask Sister Fields if the one that was just dug and a plaque there in memory of Robert Fields and his passion for souls and mission, you ask them if it's not special. It's part of who we are. It's part of our history. It's part of our purpose and our mission. And yet, let me tell you what's sad. What was sad here in the first century, that well right there is part of their spiritual heritage and history, and God's people wouldn't go there anymore because they didn't like who lived around it. Now, how about that? How messed up could we be? How messed up were they? Jesus had to go to Samaria. And John tells us it's about noon. It's about noon when the disciples go into town to get lunch. And that's when the lady comes. One writer asked these questions. Why didn't she go early in the morning? Most Samaritan people did. They went to the well twice a day, early in the morning, late in the afternoon, so they'd have enough for the day and then the night. And they would go back today. Why didn't she go early in the morning? Maybe she did. Or maybe she didn't. He wrote, maybe it was the other women she was avoiding. A walk in the hot sun was a small price to pay in order to escape their sharp tongues. Here she comes. Have you heard? She's got a new man. And the gossip starts flowing once again. Maybe she chose to simply avoid that talk. Thought she was going and would be there alone. She comes. But Jesus stuns her by greeting her and initiating a conversation with her. I loved how an eloquent author envisioned it. You can see what you think about this. He was seated on the ground, legs outstretched, hands folded, his back resting against the well. His eyes were closed. She stopped and looked at him. She looked around. No one was near. She looked back at him. He was obviously Jewish. What was he doing here? His eyes opened, hers ducked in embarrassment. Sensing her discomfort, he asked her for water. But she was too streetwise to think that's all he wanted. So essentially she says, "You're a Jew? I'm a Samaritan woman. Since when does a guy like you ask a girl like me for a drink of water?" I love this next line. Her intuition was partly correct. He was interested in more than water, wasn't he? He was interested in her life. He was interested in her soul. He was interested in her heart. He was interested in her life being turned around, transformed, saved, redeemed forever. You see, I want to pause here, and I want to read to you what Jen Hatmaker wrote after the events of this past week. She said, and I quote, "What a terrible, violent week." And so we're calling all peacemakers. Who will broker peace among us? Who will do this hard and holy work? Who will go between people that fear and harm each other and build bridges? We have to do it. Do what you can today to create peace. Forgive somebody. Call someone you've been meaning to encourage. Invite someone over that operates way outside your lane. Eat lunch in a different part of town. Tip 40%. Offer kind words to someone that may be especially hurting and scared this week. Choose grace when your mind tells you to choose a barb or a zinger. Pray deeply. Pray sincerely. Believe that the peaceful man from Nazareth knew what he was talking about when he told us to forgive and love our enemies and defend the innocent and lay down our rights for others. We're calling all peacemakers, and the time to stand up is now. Do you agree with that? I do. I do. The Prince of Peace has come. He had to go through Samaria. He's at a well. His life intersects a thirsty woman who doesn't know what her real need is. She's been trying to band-aid her needs for a long time. He talks to her about the emptiness in her soul and where she's been trying to turn to fill her thirst. She's had 5 husbands. I wonder if any of them had died. I wonder how many times one of them walked out on her. I wonder how many times she threw in the towel and said, "I can't take this anymore." I wonder how many of them broke her heart. All of them? I wonder how long each marriage lasted. I wonder why she kept marrying the same kind of man. I wonder if she ever talked to anybody about that. I wonder what her childhood was like. What unresolved issues she might have had. I don't know. What I know is she's thirsty. And from verse 10 and following, Jesus offers her what she really needs, and that's living water. And like an old quartet song says, it wasn't from the well. It's the water that's going to be drawn from Emmanuel's veins. It's a fountain that's free, that's 'tis for you and me. And he's going to bid us all, like he did her, to come and freely drink. As you know, she tries to change the subject initially. She asked him in verse 20 where God is. I want to pause here for just a moment, and I want to say this. I believe there's seeking people all around us that have got good questions to ask. She wants to know if God's accepting worship on this mountain or if the real place to go is down there back in Jerusalem. There are people who have good questions and they're seeking. She wants to know where God is. And do you remember the answer? We could talk a long time about worship. We could talk a long time about a lot of things here. But what was the bottom line of his answer? She wants to know where God is, and what does he say? You're looking at him. I am he. I'd like to have been a fly on that well and seen her reaction and seen his. It's what makes the phrase in verse 28 jump off the page of Scripture, leaving her water jar. As has been frequently pointed out in numerous sermons of the past, that's why she came to the well. It was one of the burdens she was carrying that day. But after her encounter with Jesus, she no longer will carry that burden. I remember one time Brother Mark Killen speaking on this lesson here, and he had on a stand up here a water jar. And he asked us to envision her leaving it and going back into town. And I don't know the first people she encountered, if they looked skeptically at her or not, if they looked with scorn at her because of her past or not, I don't know. I don't know if that's who she issued the invitation to, or if she went to the friends who'd stuck with her through all of her messes. I don't know. But whomever it was, she said, come. Come. I want you to see a man who's told me everything that I've ever done. Could this be the Messiah? Could this be the Christ? I'll close with two fascinating thoughts that John then shares with us. When the disciples came back from lunch, it seems to indicate in the text that Jesus doesn't eat, but rather talks. I find that very interesting. One writer speculated that